There's a few people in the comment section who are complaining that I'm spending too much time talking about the Pope, but I'm afraid that's not going to change. My background is in theology. I was brought up as a Catholic. I moved to the Greek Orthodox Church, but it doesn't change my interests. And this is, to my mind, the biggest story in the news at the moment. And as I said the other day, it's a story that pushed even Putin off the front page. And I'd like to talk about the future of the Catholic Church after the death of Pope Francis, a pontiff who was at once a reformer and a provocateur, a man of gestures and contradictions, and his passing has left not just a symbolic void, but a church and a global challenge for his successor. And Francis juggled the balance between reform and tradition by projecting extraordinary charisma and extraordinary kindness. Something that there was a rabbi I was looking at yesterday who was talking about the Pope's kindness. And while a second Francis is unlikely, Francis too would seem too overtly imitative. What is more certain is this, that the next Pope will be expected to uphold the spirit of, not of Francis, but of Vatican II, as his four predecessors have since the 1960s. But whether that means appeasing conservative anxieties, as for example Benedict did, or accelerating lay empowerment, remains to be seen, and that is something that Francis was doing. And it didn't necessarily make headlines. Let's begin with Francis' final weeks. His Easter message, short, breathless, reportedly read on his behalf, rather than whether he intended that to happen or whether it was just simply an inevitability once he got onto the balcony. That's not clear, but it mentioned Gaza, it mentioned Ukraine. It was brief but unambiguous. And his deep concern for the marginalized, from Gazan Christians to migrants, was one of the few unwavering themes of his pontificate. That clarity was not always present elsewhere. And his final meeting with the US President J.D. Vance could not have been an easy encounter. Vance's rhetoric, America First Christian nationalism, stands in tension with Francis's theology of encounter and fraternity. And it's telling that in Francis's final published letter to US bishops, he denounced the idea that Christian love is concentric nationalism. It was, in effect, a direct rebuke to Vance. Vance was paid off with Easter eggs. Francis leaves behind a church divided, more divided, in fact, than it was when he assumed the papacy in 2013, but I don't think that was the result of Francis. I think that's the result of other external influences. He reawakened debates, however, many assumed dormant after the Second Vatican Council, about sexual ethics, about the nature of authority, about the balance between doctrine and mercy, or doctrine and kindness, depending on how you interpret those words. But crucially, he rarely settled those debates. He governed like a Jesuit rector, stirring dialogue, rarely closing it. And in doing so, he changed the music more than the lyrics. He didn't alter Catholic doctrine on same-sex union, communion for the divorced, or priestly celibacy, but he allowed the conversations about these to flourish and at times, of course, to fester. His supporters saw him as a bridge builder. His critics saw him as a muddler in chief. And the next pope will be elected by a college of cardinals largely appointed by Francis himself. But as recent history shows, John Paul II's cardinals elected Benedict. Benedict's cardinals elected Francis. Conclaves are not predictive, and we can, despite that, discern two paths. Path one is a centralist stabilizer, someone who cools the temperature, a pope who says less but governs more. And path two is another surprise, perhaps from the global south, continuing the trend away from European control, and this would affirm the demographic reality of Catholicism. Africa and Asia are the future, but an American pope, unlikely, too politically fraught. Rome rarely elects from the world's superpower, especially not now. I think one has to look very firmly at the Ukrainian cardinal in Ukraine and in Melbourne, and I think one also has to look at the Patriarch of Jerusalem, both young, both only recently elevated to the position of cardinal. There are Whoever is elected will face 5 immediate complex tasks. The clerical abuse and accountability issue. Francis made symbolic progress, but he faltered in practice. His sheltering of figures like Marco Rubnik and Makaric raised eyebrows, and the new pope must pair public contrition with institutional transparency. No more loopholes. Secondly, he needs to reform the way the church works. Francis micromanaged, but the reforms were often inconsistent. The next pope must decide, should Rome centralize power or finally trust the bishops, which was the idea of trusting bishops, the idea of collegiality, the collegiality of control of government through the bishops and the priests and the laity. This was the message of Vatican II. Third point is synodality and lay power. And Francis promoted synodality, often more buzzword than blueprint, and the laity expected a seat at the table. Will the next pope deliver real co-responsibility or reassert clericalism in more charismatic form? Fourthly, the issue of China and and global politics. The Vatican's secretive deal with Beijing, permitting Chinese vetting of bishops, has enraged human rights activists. The new pope will have to choose between diplomatic pragmatism and prophetic courage. And fifthly, and most importantly, the divide between the global north and the south over sexuality, gender, and liberal democracy will deepen, particularly if the next pope is African. Whether unity is possible or even desirable will become a live question. Francis's greatest legacy may be his refusal to be trapped in binary categories. He was not the liberal pope many wished for. He upheld traditional teachings on abortion, contraception, and the male priesthood, but he asked who he was to judge gay people. That tension between mercy and discipline was at the heart of his papacy, and he brought the papacy out of the apostolic palace into the streets, and he chose a modest apartment, plain shoes, simple vestments. He disarmed through humility, yet wielded enormous spiritual power, often without oversight. He also brought politics into the Vatican, or rather revealed that it had always been there. His diplomacy on climate change, migration, and Gaza will echo long after his death. So what happens after Pope Francis? There will be no second Francis, but his questions will haunt whoever takes the role of the pontiff, whoever is the next pope. The questions posed by Francis will haunt the next papacy, and the Church will not reverse Vatican II. 4 popes in succession have committed to it. The question is whether the Council's promise of renewal, of greater inclusion, of aggiornamento will be fulfilled or indefinitely postponed. In the shadow of clerical abuse and in the middle of global division, the Church faces a choice: defend its structure or evangelize its soul. And in that decision, the next pope will not just inherit the keys of Peter, he will inherit a church aching for clarity and aching for hope after 60 years.